Welcome to Press On Podcast with Mike Woodruff, where Mike and invited guests share insights to cultivate a biblical perspective and thoughtful resilience in challenging times.
Welcome back to the Press On Podcast. My name is Mike Woodruff, and today I have the privilege of talking with Ronald Reno, also known as Rusty Reno. Rusty is one of the guys that if you'd asked me why I'm going to start a podcast, I'll say, because then I get to have these conversations with people like Rusty Reno. Dr. Reno has a PhD from Yale. He is the editor of First Things, which is a magazine we'll talk about in a second. And First Things is actually more than just a magazine. We'll talk about that in a second. He was formerly a professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University. He's the author of several books, including The Return of the Strong Gods, and he is a theological and political conservative, an adult convert from the Episcopal Church to the Catholic Church, a father, a husband, and an avid rock climber.
Indeed. I was rock climbing on Columbus Day with a young friend.
Okay. And what does rock climbing mean? So I picture guys, going up, no ropes, and it's all
we use ropes,
high drama.
But we, climbing up the side of the cliff and putting pieces of gear in and all that sort of thing. It's I tell my friends that it's relaxing because I can't think about work.
Got it. Well, I used to sail, and I used to say sailing is the only place where it can be high drama at 3 miles an hour, and you have to be paying attention to the wind and the waves and everything else, and so you don't think about.
Yep. Rock climbing is very similar.
Okay. Well, so let's talk about First Things. First Things was founded 25 years ago now?
Our first issue was March 1990, so 33 years. 33
years ago. Founded by Richard John Newhouse. Founded as so First Things are primary foundational starting principles. Talk about what those are, because this is all politics and culture are downstream from First Things. So what are the First Things, and then what is First Things?
God, the moral law, beauty, and then also how do we engage these things in a way that's relevant to the kinds of difficult questions we face as a society. So First Things has always tried to mediate between these kind of things that almost beckon contemplation rather than action, but nonetheless we try to speak about them in ways that allow a person to be a regular reader and feel like they're acting or making decisions if they're in positions of responsibility, or they're voting or, in ways that are thoughtful and arise out of their deepest convictions. That's what the magazine wants to do. Deepen understanding of these fundamental truths of the faith, fundamental truths of the moral life, but also link them to contemporary affairs. I think we're kind of unique in this regard. I mean, other magazines do that, but I try to get the magazine to have a theology piece, a culture piece, and, if you will, a kind of politics piece. And I don't mean politics in the narrow sense. We don't talk about the electoral cycle or candidates or anything like that. But I mean, we all are aware that we live in a very fraught time, and we're kind of almost forced to take stances on issues. And so I try to get those three, but I don't just want it to be culture war 24/7. That's just so exhausting. We try to have something in there that people can relish, enjoy. We know what we're against, but we also want to know what we're for. Sometimes that's the hardest part.
So talk for a second about, because you're trying to do all that, and you're using the magazine as that's sort of your flagship.
The website does stuff daily, supplements, yes.
And you've got a podcast.
The podcast.
And I've been to events in Chicago. You interviewed Russ Douthat. I was at the event in Austin, Texas. You had Dr. Harper. So you've got an intellectual retreat. I mean, there's just a variety of things that you're doing, and it's all, you're inviting people into a worldview, you're inviting them into a community, you're inviting them into what?
Well, we often, our churches can provide very effective spiritual formation, how to become, how to become more thoroughly, more completely a disciple of Christ. Intellectual formation, though, is you kind of go to college, maybe you go to law to get a law degree, whatever, and you go out in your professional life, and you're continuously being formed in your area of expertise.
Or malformed.
Well, I mean, the doctor becomes a better doctor, the architect becomes a better architect. And, but what, to your point about being malformed, is that we don't continue to form ourselves intellectually with respect to the truths of the faith, moral truths, the literary inheritance of our own culture, historical knowledge. And so we have stuff on the visual arts on occasion in the magazine. So the idea is, how can we, as Christians, be formed not just spiritually, but also intellectually? Church does that too, often with respect to theology, but not in these other areas.
So I have read First Things for, I don't know, probably starting around 2000, maybe 2005. I almost quit in 2010.
Yeah, it's a rough year.
I went through an issue and I didn't mark it up at all. And I said to a mutual friend, Larry Smith, who regularly told me he had read every word of every edition. And I said, this magazine is sort of lost its bite or something. And he says, yeah, I'm going to write to them. The next thing I knew, he's on your board. So he obviously wrote, I don't know, were you there then or you were just about to come on?
No, I was already the editor-in-chief, and that was in 2011 that they made me editor-in-chief. And I think Larry came on board in 2012 or 2013.
Okay.
It was part of the founder of the magazine, Richard John Newhouse, very charismatic man. And it's a classic founder's scenario where the founder, he carries the project just by force of personality. Well, he died in 2009. And how do you sustain and build and renew the charism when that charismatic figure is not there? And that's an institution building kind of moment.
Right.
And so I think a lot of our efforts in the teens was, how do we institutionalize? How do we build an institution that carries forward this basic vision? And I don't think the magazine, look, 2023 is way different from 1990. 1990, the religious right had emerged in the late 70s and into the 80s. 1968 wasn't that long ago in 1990. Mm-hmm. And Reagan's election in 1980, John Paul II, 1979. And so the magazine was founded in a kind of optimistic sense that Christians engaged in public matters could recover some of the foundations of American life, especially in the Christian influence on American life, and I think as 2023, that seems a lot less. That's a lot less available to us.
So let me. I want to go there, but I want to just do a little bit more foundational querying here. So I recommend First Things to folks, but I do it selectively because it's a tough read for a lot of people.
One of my readers said it's like reading First Things is like getting a master's degree.
Yeah. Okay. So there you go. I read it, and about half of the articles I'm particularly engaged in, and I love your little spot I love your column, and then you've got something at the end where it's just a bunch of random observations. Some of the things, I'm not Catholic, so there's a lot of things that don't interest me, or I just don't even understand them.
Yes.
And so who are you? What brings you to the spot where you can edit this kind of a magazine? Because I often sort of scratch my head and say, wow, I could not do this job. But what brings you to this moment that you are able to sort of, it's a broad horizon, it seems to me. And who exactly are you writing for?
People ask this, right? Because we've got Protestant writers, Jewish writers, we have Jewish columnists, Catholic, as you mentioned. It's very Catholic heavy.
Occasionally Orthodox, and I think you've had some Muslims.
We have had Muslims write for us. The unifying commitment is that a deeper obedience to God's will humanize us, will actually make us more fully human. You know, in the 21st century West, that is a heretical commitment, because our society tells us, no, if we follow our heart's desire, that will lead to happiness, and that will be a more fully human life. So we're really unified on that basic affirmation. Now, if the society changes and it embraces this as the vision of the good life, ever deeper obedience to God's will, we'll probably fall apart and quarrel with each other about what God's will is really calling us to do. But in this moment in history, it's a powerful unifying commitment, given how strongly our culture sort of pushes against that vision.
I have to say, I'm this past weekend, we're recording this on October 12th, I think.
I think so.
And so we're a week into the war. Israel's declared war about a week ago.
Yes.
And I just preached, so I'm going through the book of Exodus. And right now, I sort of laughed that everybody is doing Exodus. So it's not just that I know lots of churches that are going through Exodus, but you have all these sort of public figures. So Leon Kass came out with a big commentary on Exodus. And the conservative radio, Jewish radio host Dennis Prager came out with a commentary on Exodus. And Jordan Peterson has been doing lectures on Exodus. And I could go on. I mean, and I just keep seeing Exodus everywhere. And I think it's because as society crumbles, some people at least are going back to saying, what has kept the Jews together? What are the foundational pieces? But in the sermon this past weekend, I said, I'm going to call a timeout and go to 30,000 feet. And I just want to note, lots of people go to Exodus about freedom. And so it's got a slave chorus and a civil rights theme. And Martin Luther King Jr. is obviously often going to Exodus. I just want to note, the message here is not you're free, you're free, you're free. We've crossed the Red Sea, you're free. Sleep in, sleep around. The first thing is, here's the rules, and this is how life works. And I said, we have such a radically different understanding of freedom right now. And for that matter, it's not even let my people go free. It's let my people go free so that they may worship me. And these are just big countercultural themes right now to say we're free in a right relationship with God, rightly ordering our loves, our fears, our priorities. That's what you're saying.
It's easy to think that, the freedom motif in Exodus is kind of in tension with the Sinai dimension of Exodus. But, that's not true at all. No. For freedom, Christ has set me free, says St. Paul. Well, the freedom is not to do what he wants. The freedom is a freedom from bondage to sin and death so that he can more perfectly serve his Lord. So that's I think the biblical understanding of freedom is that, serving yourself is a kind of hall of mirrors. I mean, I don't think it's even really possible. So you don't serve yourself, you serve your idea of yourself. And you don't serve the pleasure, you serve whatever, our current culture tells you is what, it's travel or it's fine wine or whatever. So I think unless we're serving God, we're serving idols. And, God has our best interests at heart, and idols don't. And so one is a bondage, the other is freedom, because it draws us to be that which we were created to become.
Okay, so I'm not getting through initial questions, which is sort of what I expected because we have lots of common interests. I want to go back. You did a PhD. Before you came to First Things, you were teaching. You were teaching theology?
I taught for 20 years at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay.
It's a Jesuit university.
And your doctoral studies were in religion?
It was in theology and culture, I would say.
Okay.
I mean, I did a dissertation. Effectively, it was on, I was a Protestant. Modern Protestant theology is preoccupied with the question of the authority of God in relation to the modern world and modern science and a modern culture of freedom, et cetera, the sorts of things we were talking about. And that preoccupied me. And so and it also, I think it's the main thread of certainly the sort of great 19th century German tradition that's so fundamental for Protestant theology, and at least in the academic sphere. So in a sense, what I'm doing at First Things is really very continuous with my own training. Like one of my friends who's a kind of Thomas of the strict observance, he always laughs at me and says, "Oh, Rusty, you were never really a scholar." And he doesn't mean that as criticism. It's more noting that I'm kind of actually doing what God probably it's called me to do from the very get-go.
Right. Well, and scholars often have a very narrow focus.
It's hugely important to have people who really know things.
Right. And you know everything about, you learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing, right?
That's the reductio ad absurdum, and it's always a danger, I agree.
Right. But you are now, again, just from reading your columns, you are not knowing a lot about a little. It's broad. It's poetry, it's cultural allusions, it's political allusions, it's literature. There's just a lot there that's why I say this is not an easy read. And it's also not the first thing I'm trying to give to people. They've come to faith in Christ. It's like, okay, we're going to talk about the basics. There's a catechism here. There's rules you got to
read the Gospels.
This is not what you need to be reading. But at some point, it's like, okay, there's a tradition. There's an ongoing conversation. It's a few thousand years old. You enter into it. You understand what's going on. So, okay. So, I wanted to ask. So, when I think of a new house. Naked Public Square is sort of the book, the phrase,
it's book. It came out in 1984. It was a pushback against, in the 70s, there was a growing kind of intellectual, scholarly, liberal project saying that true liberalism excludes, metaphysical and theological commitments. And that book...
That you can be neutral.
Not that you can't, not just that you can be, but that you must be.
But you must, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And the book is an argument that, it's a defense, interestingly, of Jerry Falwell, that although they held different kinds of views, they had very similar convictions about the way in which theology informs public policy. That is to say, Martin Luther King Jr. and Jerry Falwell. And it's actually a brilliant, and it's actually quite convincing. Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, clearly his Christian faith was at the foundation of his social witness, his witness for racial justice. And so that's to say that Martin Luther King Jr. is not a hero of the American project, because he brought theology and God and the New Testament into his...
Not today. I mean, so yes, a hero, but from a distance, right? Today.
That aspect is downplayed. So you go to the King Memorial in Washington, D.C., you would have no idea that he was a Baptist pastor.
Yeah. Huh.
Because obviously that was at the foundation of his identity that grew out of the necessities of his own, of the realities of the Black experience in his lifetime. So his social ministry grew out of his Christian ministry. No doubt about that.
Right. Well, so, by the way, I was a college pastor for 8 years, and this is in the late '80s, early '90s, and I remember having a conversation with the dean. I'd given a talk, called them dorm talks. I'd given a talk in a dorm, and had made the comment at some point that calling people forward to, I said, look, you don't want to sleep around. Like your best, God's rules are actually in your benefit. You don't want to sleep around. And so afterwards, this assistant dean said, you have to be neutral in what you say. You have to give the opposite opinion. And we were talking about this round and round, and she kept saying, you have to be neutral. You have to be neutral. And I said, you realize that's not a neutral statement, right? You're taking a position.
Yes.
She's like, I'm taking the neutral position. I go,
exactly.
No, you're not. But
the capital N neutral.
Right, it was so
the obligatory neutral.
It was so maddening. But anyway, so do we still have a naked public square, or would you say that's not where we're at all?
Well, the woke business has a strongly religious character. I mean, there's a lot of, I remember going to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in New York and people bending their knees. And I thought, any sociologist would identify this as having strong religious qualities to it. And certainly neutrality of the sort that this dorm advisor or administrator was insisting upon, that seems to have fallen by the wayside. So in some sense, it seems like maybe that was an historical moment of equipoise, where the liberal, the sincere liberal could say, I don't really have any views, I'm just a neutral arbitrator. That seems to be passing. I think that's part of the polarization that we're experiencing, is the feeling that people have, is very acute actually among younger people, the awareness that no, you actually have to be on one side or the other.
Right.
And that's painful I'm a baby boomer, late baby boomer. It's painful because, we kind of want to keep everything together and find the proper middle ground. And I don't begrudge that. I don't think that's a bad impulse in any particular moment. But you do have to know the reality of the time you live in. And so how do we live in a polarized era, with a kind of charity of heart is going to be a real challenge.
So when we were together in Austin a couple months ago, I said I wanted to talk about journalism, and I do. But since you've gone there, I want to say I just got I got an email. I don't know this guy. Responding to a newsletter I put out, and he said, I'm 70 years old, retired, and like Solomon, a confirmed curmudgeon. There's nothing new under the sun. Like many of its antecedents, today's culture is narcissistic, ephemeral, and largely willingly irrational. Trying to navigate this is a waste of time. History reflects the same tired refrain. To paraphrase Hegel, decadence, consequence, and regret. Restoration is never guaranteed. America's founding principles, resources, and beneficial geography offered humanity one last chance to get it right. The grand experiment has failed. With no such real estate left on Earth for a do-over, it's clear to see where the global village is in the history cycle. Engage with what? No thanks. My circle is getting smaller, and I'm good with it. So I wrote to him and have engaged him a little bit. And he wrote back and said, I'm glad that you can have hope. I can't. And I said, well, yes, you can. And, I'm trying to pull him forward. So there's a lot of exhausted people. There's a lot of frustrated people. There's a lot of negative people. And then there's just a lot of angry, anxious, partisan people. So what is the response? What should we do? What is the right, or let me just not ask for the right. Let me not ask for your opinion. Let me ask for your observation about the different responses Christians have available to them at this moment.
Yeah, wow, big question. I mean, the first imperative is to don't prevaricate. It's always tempting when somebody says, or as you pointed out, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. There are a lot of things to be frustrated about, and there are a lot of things to be angry about. So we can't pretend that the West isn't in a kind of world of hurt. I mean, just take fertility rates. I mean, wow, it's like somebody come to the hospital. Oh my God, your blood pressure is through the roof. You got to go for an immediate examination. Declining life expectancy in our country. That's like the blood pressure. I mean, the pulse rate.
The opioid crisis and suicide, deaths of despair.
Yes, these are really bad. 25% of women are likely not to be married by the time they're 40, and they will never get married. So these are serious, serious problems on the one hand. On the other hand, people who are, they read a lot, they can write letters like that man wrote. We're the kind of educated class. My experience in New York City, where I live, is that anxiety about the future of the country, polarization, anger, it declines as you go down the social scale. And that kind of Mr. 50th percentile actually wants to get along with the people he works with, wants to get along with his neighbors, isn't, in fact, addicted to MSNBC or Fox News. And so we got to realize that a lot of the problems are with us, our elites, and our anxieties and fixations. So the country itself has a lot of problems, but it's not. We shouldn't assume that everybody's sort of in the same hyper polarized state of mind that many of us are in. So those are some random thoughts. Now, specifically with Christians, I reject this fellow's negative Hegelianism, right? It's a kind of, instead of inevitable progress, it's inevitable regress, or the last hope. We should be always rereading Ecclesiastes. There's a different seasons, and we should be doing our best to preserve and protect and promote the things that we know to be good.
Good.
You do your best. That's all that God asks for us to do. And I do think that listeners should be thinking about how do I, praying for God to give them guidance with respect to how can I promote your will for my country, for my neighbors, for the globe. How can I do that? That should be a constant prayer for us. How? What's the path forward? As opposed to, despair.
Right. Well, by the way, are you familiar with the statement "touch grass"? Have you heard that?
Sounds great to me. I like that idea.
Well, it just came across my radar about a week ago that I guess it's what young people say to others when they're too wrapped up in the news or in video gaming or in something artificial. They go, "You need to touch grass."
I think Matthew Crawford is one of the best writers out there right now. And his recent book, Why We Drive, is a very sneaky, smart book of political philosophy. And the basic thesis is that the fundamental human intelligence is the ability to navigate through the world, to grapple with the real things, and to engage them. And we've lost a lot of that in our virtual world. And there's a lot to be said for gardening.
Right.
Or sewing, or whatever. In his
rock
case,
climbing.
Rock climbing, it is. And in his case, it's this kind of fool's errand of trying to rebuild the Volkswagen Bug.
Yes. Forest bathing. Are you familiar with that term? Just the idea that you just got to get out in nature. You just got to get outside.
Yes.
Yes, gardening, fixing a VW bug. Well, okay, I want to push a different angle of my question. So, I agree. I don't know of any other thing other than to get up and to love and to serve. And I say to people, said it to the staff earlier this week. I go, look, I have to schedule more time in silence and more time in reading and reflecting. I have to fight for hope sometimes. But I need to leave my study in the morning saying, I can be a giver. I've got energy. I can bring some energy to these projects and to these problems. And I got to work at that more intentionally than I used to. So I'm with you. But I think the question I want to ask is a little bit more specific, and that is, when I look at the world, and we're in the 2023s, and the West is tired, and people are exhausted, and there's more. We've seen a rise away from neutrality, which used to frustrate me. And then when people said, "Okay, I'm not going to be neutral," you can't speak. I was like, "Oh, wait.
Well, let's go back to the good old days.
Let's go back to neutrality." When I just thought you were crazy, but at least you let me talk. Now you won't even let me talk. So there is a crass. There's obviously, we got Niebuhr with his different Christ and culture comments. We could say there's the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots and the Essenes. We could just say there's holy war at one end and there's pacifism or the Amish on the other end. And there's a lot, and we could do this with 3D chess and X and Y axes. But there's names out there, Wilberforce or Rod Dreher writing about the Benedictine option.
Yes.
He's going to be a guest in a couple weeks. So there's Richard Don Newhouse. There's Rusty Reno. There's nationalism. There's other options. What do you think are the main categories out there that are vying for people's attention, and where are you trying to steer them? What should their frame of reference to how do I live in this world be?
Yeah, boy. I think Rod's Benedict option is right, that we cannot raise our children on the assumption that going to church on Sunday will be enough, and that the rest of the culture will kind of help them along.
And so we
need to be much more intentional.
I should just jump in and say, Rod Dreher is a Orthodox Christian writer, and the Benedict option sort of harkens back to Pope Benedict and the Benedictines, who sort of helped pull Europe out of the Dark Ages. Maybe you want to...
Islands of sanity in a world gone mad is basically his idea. And there's a lot to that. But, we're big. 20%, 25% of Americans go to church every Sunday. And so we're kidding ourselves if we think that the culture at large is going to just leave us alone. As we know, if only they would leave us alone, sometimes you feel. So we do have, it's inevitable that we're going to be engaged in the public affairs of our town, of our state, of our country. And so we have to figure out how to do so in a way that both honors the truths of the faith and at the same time actually is realistic. That's not easy, it seems to me. But Jonah, who he was so pessimistic. Oh, those Ninevites. It's just God, you're just wasting my time. I'm going to go, they're just going to get mad at me, persecute me. What do?
They repent.
They repent. And then Jonah gets mad for the fact that they repent.
Right. Which seemed to have been part of his very narrow, tribalistic approach to what was going on.
But I think that there's a lesson for us in that if God is calling us, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can work hard to build strong Christian communities that are insulated from the worst excesses of our time. And I think every parent ought to seek that for his and her children. But we can also participate in the public life of our country. And I think we have a duty to our fellow citizens. Love your neighbor as yourself. We just don't want to abandon them to the pathologies of the present moment. So I think we can do both. You can't do both all the time. You can't do both, and we're called in different ways. One thing I've told friends is that very few people are called to governance. And we should be informed citizens and all that kind of stuff. But, I am not called to vote on laws, and my vocation is not to govern. I'm an opinionator. I write things. And that's a different. So we all have to discern what it is that God's calling us to do in this fraught moment. It could be that God's calling you to be a parent first and foremost. Or to have a workplace, if you're in a position of responsibility in the workplace, to create a workplace that's actually nurtures, it brings the best out in people. I think we need to make those discernments. And again, it doesn't mean you remain ignorant of other aspects of life or don't have views and don't say what needs to be said on occasion, but. I think it's a pathology that we're all swept up into the political debates of the moment all the time.
So I hear you. Rejecting is too strong of a word, but you would not categorize yourself in a holy war camp. If at the other side of the holy war camp is and I think it's a caricature of Dreyer's view that it's withdraw. Separationism. You're more in a Wilberforce camp, although that's sort of a bad use because you're saying I'm not called to vote on laws, and that obviously he was public life. He was called to vote on laws, but that I'm going to stay in society and try and seek justice and work within the system.
Do what good that can be done. I think that one of the temptations, certainly, of progressives is to be engaged in what I would call a sacred politics. They sacralize politics in a way, and a holy war among our fellow Christians can often be a version of that same thing. And Jesus said that render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, unto God that which is God's. And he told Pilate that my kingdom is not of this world. And the effect of that on the West was to say that we're not supposed to treat public realm as the arena where we work out our salvation. Mm-hmm. And so that lets us look at, the affairs of the city, the affairs of the state, as things where, we want to be informed by the gospel, but we're not implementing the gospel. I think one of the dangers of Christians is you think we're going to govern with the Sermon on the Mount as a template for how to govern. I don't want that from the President of the United States. On the other hand, I would like my leaders to be influenced by the Sermon on the Mount. And I think one effect of that is to say that I think Christianity's influence on the culture of the West was to minimize violence. You can't live without the just war tradition. I'm a Catholic. I'm not a pacifist. That we have to be prepared to use violence to restrain evil. Romans 13. But I think Christianity its influence has been to say, we need to do this in a way that's the least violent that we can. And you see that in the kind of punishments that are imposed, and as compared to the Roman world, that kind of relished the kind of spectacle of suffering. I think Christianity. So that's the influence I see of Christianity. But beware trying to take the New Testament as a charter for a new society. That's the church, and God will institute that in the age to come.
So I've got one eye on the clock, and I've got lots more questions. So I'm going to pivot us to journalism, because this is what I've been thinking about a lot lately. And you're a journalist, and you're publishing a magazine.
Happily so, yes.
So I sort of I'm giving these talks, and I see my three starting assumptions are it's an unsettled moment that we're living in. It's not the worst of all possible moments, but there's things going wrong. We've got to pay attention. Two, I think the news has become part of the problem.
Indeed.
As a pastor, I see. I realized somebody asked me, "Do you think you have competition in shaping the spiritual lives of your people?" And I said, and I sort of surprised myself because I hadn't thought about it. I said, I'd be happy to be in the top 10 influences of the people that I'm pastoring. I said, and they go, is it like other churches? And I go, I wish. I said, I don't love everybody on the radio. It's
if only they could be seduced by Catholicism.
well, yeah, okay, fair enough.
Not overly seduced, but
right.
romanced, at least a little.
But I said it's talk radio. I get a half hour a week, and they get 3 hours a day. And I said, and I started to say to people, please recognize who you've invited into your heart. You're a disciple of who, right? And so I started to think about this. It led me to start this newsletter where I was just trying to introduce other ideas and books and draw in the long conversation, like people have thought about these things, be shaped by this other stuff. And then the last point I make is I go, look, we're responsible for our heart. So if the news is becoming toxic, we have to understand what's going on. So it's, how and why the news is changing, how it's changing us, and what we can do about it. And part of what I say, to cut to the quick chase, is to say, read a lot less news. You just don't need the news. Turn off the TV. That's got its own appeal as a news source. It's going to be more reaching to your emotions. It's often not even news, it's opinion. There's not enough out there to keep you going, but they know how to push all your buttons. The people that push buttons are getting smarter and smarter. The AI, the algorithms, all this stuff, it's becoming, we're getting sucked down these wormholes. Just enough already, back up. And then I try and explain what I think is happening and what they can do about it. So do you agree with my three starting assumptions? And what's your take on what's happening to the news?
A lot's been written about the changed business model of newspapers and, to a lesser extent, TV. In the old days, if you wanted, Marshall Field's big sale, Chicago Tribune, big ad spend, and so ad money flowed in, and advertisers, it gave money for newsrooms to basically do as they wanted. That's collapsed about 10 years ago, and now it's a subscription-based revenue model. And so you have to craft your news to appeal to your subscriber base. So you got to feed them what they want to hear. And I think, people need to recognize that their news sources now, unlike when was the case 20 years ago, that their news sources are telling them what they want to hear. That's never a good recipe for being well-informed, because, it's like, okay, I already know that. Tell me something I don't know. So I think consumers of news need to be much more skeptical than was probably the case in years past. And it is interesting, I think, if a pastor 25 years ago would have said, what's the biggest, threat to your influence? You would have said Hollywood, probably. And it's interesting now that it's really the political and all of the furor that has supplanted Hollywood as the great, I don't know, it transfixes our eyes somehow. It has an ability just to grab us and get us fixated and command our passions. We live in a very political age. Why is that? Well, maybe it's because the spiritual consensus of the West is so weak. And so we are actually fighting over first things. And it feels like everything is at stake all the time.
It feels like news is part of the weaponry in a effort to define reality. Whose reality is going to prevail? And so it does feel existential in some ways.
And it is. I mean, I think, again, part of what I'm opposed to the one theory that rules them all, the Lord of the theories. Reality is too complex for that. But there are moments when you can use kind of big picture thinking to try to get a sense of a real and powerful aspect of reality. There's no doubt that the technological age that we live in promises us it's a kind of gospel, and ultimately it's a rival gospel, which is that technology will save us from death, and that we won't die. Now, transhumanism is very implausible scientifically, but the fact that it's out there and the fact that it gains traction in the sort of, especially in the tech world, is an indication that it is actually a spiritual promise that technology makes. And if we don't, maybe if it's not live forever, it's at least we can control our own death, or we can live longer on our own terms. We don't have to suffer aging and things like that. So it is a gospel, and it's a gospel that is that our clever human cleverness can triumph over the limitations of nature. Gender assigned at birth is alluring because behind it is mortality assigned at death. That my mortality is actually as optional as my being male or female. And that's why, although very few people, many mainstream secular people are responsible. They don't want their kids to necessarily be involved, but they don't resist this. And I think it's because they feel the allure of that gospel, which is the gospel of freedom from the limitations of nature.
Right.
Which is it's very powerful. I mean, plastic surgery. I mean, when you start to think about it, we're pretty far along on this. I mean, Bruce Jenner, I guarantee you he was taking steroids when he was 18 years old training for the Olympics. So he's been experimenting with his body for his entire adult life. And now maybe he's an extreme version of but I mean, most pharmacology now, all of the new money in drugs is in life enhancement stuff rather than disease curing. So it's this new fad for these drugs that help you lose weight, for instance, would be a good example of that. Now, some people are morbidly obese, and it is a matter of therapeutic health. But I would guarantee you that 95% of the revenue comes from people who want to go from not looking as good as they want to looking better.
And the market research was done not looking at the morbidly obese. It was looking at there's going to be this. Can you imagine what we can do with this? Yeah.
Right. So I just think that's because again, I'm against the Lord of the theories. That's not a sufficient explanation, but I think it's a powerful factor in the moment we live in. And when you begin to think about it that way, you realize like, wow, this is a spiritual struggle. This is a spiritual decision that we're going to make as a society. And that spiritual decision, if you go for technology triumphing over nature, that gospel is not going to be very tolerant of dissent. It's because its power is based on hope, because it doesn't deliver really, But if we just let it go farther, if we just give it more,
we have there's a lot of wealth in this culture, and we can suspend reality for a good long while, but eventually reality bounces back.
And the metaverse, I used to, because that's related, Mark Zuckerberg, when he first announced that, I just laughed and thought that was stupid. But then I realized that dating apps, Instagram, if you're 21 years old, you live a lot of your life virtually. And again, we're back to transgenderism and other stuff having to do with the body and nature, and the touch grass notion.
Touch grass.
And you begin to think, well, it's not an accident that a person who lives most of his or her life virtually is going to say, well, I mean, your body is not that important. Why are people so worked up? So he wants to be a boy, or he wants to be a girl. Why are you so worked up? So anyway, I feel like we're rightly looking and thinking, wow, these are fundamental questions, and it's all being worked out. But we should also be aware that our fears about this are easily manipulated by people want to sell us things, and by people who want us to vote for them.
Okay, so I want to ask you before we go to the final four. So we are 7 days into the war, and it seems to me as though and I expect that we will leave this because we did in 9/11. But I'm hearing in the news. So there's an intersection here. My question.
Yeah.
I'm hearing about evil, right? And I don't generally hear about evil, but the response, the pictures, and it's, on one hand, I'm a little confused, or I guess maybe I'm not confused, I'm just distressed. The concentration camps were largely hidden by the Nazis, but it seems like some of the atrocities have been advertised in this realm. Whether that's because everybody's got video cameras or not, but it seems like some of the worst atrocities are being public, and the reaction to that in the legacy media is to say this is evil. I'm not sure they would have used the word evil 2 months ago, but now I see evil again.
Well, I mean, it's probably good reason. I don't know how your baptism rite, but in the Catholic Church, part of the baptismal rite are renunciations. You renounce the devil and the glamour of evil, and it is the case that evil has a kind of glamour, or there's a certain. That's why the Romans had the gladiators and people being torn apart by beasts. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, reports how one of his friends was addicted to going to watch people die. So this is a tool. And I do think that Osama bin Laden certainly, and I don't know about the Hamas leadership, thinks that the West is fatally decadent, and that we will, if you will, sort of fold in the face of people who are willing to do such things, because we won't be able to muster the courage or the determination. The Nazis had a similar notion of inducing terror in the blitzkrieg and other methods of intimidation. So it's a perennial human. It goes back to the Romans. It's a perennial dark side of the human condition, and good for the mainstream media for using a theological word to describe something that is, and I think touches fundamental spiritual choices that we all have to make, both as individuals and as a society.
Okay, so we're both on the clock here. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm just looking for a short answer.
Okay.
What gives you hope?
My faith in Christ.
What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
I worry about the budget at first things on occasion. And I worry that my most talented editor will be hired away. So sometimes I want to keep my team together.
I will say there's a few other pastors that I call if it looks like we're going to make budget, or if I want to whine about the budget. And I say, not everybody wants to hear that I worry about the budget. I go, but it's got real, including the staff. And I go, look, my ability to pay you salaries Right? I mean, there's not an upside to this, but there's a big downside if we don't get this. And, I didn't go into ministry to make budget, but I really want to make the budget.
I would say too that doesn't keep me awake at night, but I'm in my darkest hour when I walk to work. I walk to work in New York City.
Dark is just it's dark.
No, it's my darkest hour spiritually every day as I walk, because I grind through things in my head. And I do worry about nuclear war. And I think people are very naive about the kind of dangers that we face in this present moment as the post-Cold War American order wobbles. And so I think, I pray that, our leadership will be, prudent enough to avoid that.
Yes. We had a prayer time today for situation in Israel, and I was praying for leaders. Like, Lord, I would not, the negotiations around hostages, and I'm just trying to imagine the decisions that have to be made.
Indeed.
In the fog of war, what's really going on. And I share some of that. Things are more fragile than I think we think.
Always, but especially now.
Okay. What book or podcast, movie, product, whatever, have you been recommending more than any other in the last few years?
I really think N.S. Lyons' Substack, The Upheaval, is I subscribe to 3 Substacks. N.S. Lyons, The Upheaval, very perceptive, a youngish guy who's coming to some realizations about, and not just political analysis, but I think kind of deeper, moral and spiritual. Matt Crawford, who I mentioned, his Arcadelia web blog, Substack, and then Paul Kingsnorth, is it The Lord of Misrule, I think is his Substack. And Paul Kingsnorth is he's the most explicitly Christian in the framework that he uses, but just a very, and these are all 3 of them, I think, dark, because it's pointing to some deep problems that we face. But, first step towards, any kind of better future is acknowledging the reality of the present.
Right. What is on your nightstand right now?
I am reading Ernst Jünger's 1970 novel, Humansweil. And I just finished reading his just transcendent kind of prose poem On the Marble Cliffs, published in 1939. Jünger is a kind of enigmatic character. He converted to Christianity at the end of his life, lived to be 102 years old. And but he's a writer, the touch grass idea. He's helped me see that in times of spiritual testing, it's very important to sort of keep contact with reality, that nature is it is a great source of sanity. It's a compass that will point us to the true north. It's God's given nature to us as a kind of immediate thing, and even unbelievers, as he was in many decades of his life, can have recourse to nature, its beauty, its and not just its beauty, but its trustworthiness. It is what it is.
Right. Well, I think some
not
of that,
what it seems, if you know what I mean. And as opposed to human beings, we can throw a great veil of deception. We can be deceived and we can deceive. Nature, the birds. Become an ornithologist, and you'll have an anchor.
So at the advice of Jamie A.K. Smith, I was at an event and we were to talk about beauty. And I was fortunate to go first, and we just had a granddaughter born, and I said, my granddaughter. And others had answers that were quite profound. But Jamie talked about, he got a bird feeder, and that was part of his touching grass. And so I went home and I bought a bird feeder. So every morning while I'm sitting in my study, when I hear a bird peck, I turn around and watch this bird and, think, wow, birds are amazing. The Lord makes birds. they're fed. He knows what's going on. It is all touching grass, looking at nature.
Junger did bugs.
Okay.
He was entomologist.
Okay.
Entomologist.
By the way, I'm reading right now the Book of the Dun Cow. Have you ever read that?
No.
Okay. You would like that. I will send you a copy. Walter Wanegren. It's fascinating. You will like it. Last question. What are you working on? So we didn't talk much about your book. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Usually,
no.
But Return of the Strong Gods. So I think this is your most recent book.
No, I've got a book on biblical interpretation that came out about a year ago.
Okay. But this has been out for a few years because it got reissued.
Yeah, 2019, and then that one in 2021 and 2022.
Okay. So are you working on a book now?
Absolutely not.
Oh, okay.
No, I need to marinate.
Okay.
It's important to write. I mean, I've written a lot of books. Sometimes I write books about things I'm interested in, and I want to make other people interested in them. Usually fail in that project. So in this book I wrote, Return of the Strong Gods, because I wanted to. I thought I wanted to try to explain to people, this crazy moment we live in. So I just need to discern and think, well, what needs to be said? A friend of mine wants me to write a memoir of rock climbing, a life of rock climbing.
Okay.
What do I know? Maybe that is the right thing to write.
Okay.
But at this point, it's not. I haven't put pen to paper.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for an interesting conversation. As I said, I started a podcast so I could have conversations like
pleasure.
this.
It's a great conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.